The loneliest betrayal doesn't happen at a funeral. It begins the moment everyone promises they'll never leave you. That was the lesson I learned after my husband of 43 years passed away. The day we laid Thomas to rest, I looked around the small cemetery outside Columbus, Ohio, and told myself that even though I had lost the love of my life, I still had my family. My son Daniel wrapped his arms around me and whispered, "You're not alone, Mom. We'll always be here." His wife, Vanessa, gently squeezed my hand and offered to help organize meals, doctor appointments, and anything else I might need. Their kindness felt genuine. As the last guest drove away, I believed the hardest part of my life had already happened. I couldn't have been more mistaken. The house felt painfully quiet that evening. Every room carried traces of Thomas. His reading glasses still rested beside his favorite chair. His old coffee mug sat drying beside the sink because I couldn't bring myself to put it away. Even the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed louder than before, marking every lonely second that stretched across the evening. I moved slowly through the kitchen, making a cup of chamomile tea exactly the way Thomas liked me to make it. Old habits have a strange way of surviving long after the people we shared them with are gone. Around 7 o'clock, Daniel and Vanessa arrived carrying containers of homemade casserole and fresh bread. They insisted I shouldn't spend my first night alone cooking dinner. We sat around the oak dining table where our family had celebrated birthdays, graduations, and every Thanksgiving for decades. Daniel smiled often, though his eyes looked tired. Vanessa kept telling me how important family was and how we needed to stay close now more than ever. I remember feeling grateful that my son had married someone who seemed to understand compassion. Looking back now, I realize how carefully some smiles can hide other intentions. After dinner, they helped wash the dishes even though I told them not to worry. Daniel hugged me once more before saying they would visit every weekend. Vanessa kissed my cheek and reminded me to call if I needed absolutely anything. I stood at the front window watching their SUV disappear down the street. For the first time since the funeral service, I felt a small sense of peace. Maybe life would never be the same, but perhaps I wouldn't have to face it completely alone. Later that night, I realized I had left my sweater folded over the back of a kitchen chair. As I walked quietly downstairs, I noticed the porch light shining through the front window. Daniel and Vanessa's SUV was parked outside again. They had apparently returned because Daniel had forgotten his tablet on the dining room table. I smiled to myself, thinking I would surprise them by opening the front door before they knocked. But as I stepped into the hallway, I heard their voices drifting through the slightly open kitchen window. They didn't know I was close enough to hear. Vanessa spoke first, her voice calm, almost casual. The sooner we get her comfortable with depending on us, the easier everything else will be. A long silence followed before Daniel answered so softly, I almost missed it. "Just give her a little more time." I froze where I stood, my hand resting against the wall. My heart wasn't racing. It was sinking slowly and quietly, as though it already understood something my mind refused to believe. I remained perfectly still until I heard the sport utility vehicle pull away for the second time. I did not open the front door. I did not confront Daniel the next morning. I did not ask Vanessa what she had meant. Instead, I stood alone in the quiet hallway listening to the grandfather clock count another minute of a life that suddenly felt unfamiliar. Sleep never came that night. I sat in Thomas's favorite recliner with a blanket over my shoulders and watched the first hint of dawn brighten the living room windows. The house looked exactly the same, yet something inside it had shifted. Perhaps the house had not changed at all. Perhaps it was simply the way I now looked at the people I loved. Over the following weeks, nothing dramatic happened. That was what made it so confusing. Daniel still called every Sunday afternoon. Vanessa still smiled whenever she stopped by with groceries or flowers. If anyone had watched us from across the street, they would have seen an ordinary family caring for a recently widowed mother. The changes were so small that each one could have been explained away on its own. The first change came when Daniel offered to help manage a few household bills because he said grieving made paperwork overwhelming. I appreciated the gesture and handed him a folder containing utility statements and insurance information. He thanked me warmly and promised to organize everything into a simpler system. A few days later, I noticed my online account passwords had been updated. Daniel explained that stronger security would protect me from scams targeting older adults. His explanation sounded reasonable, and I nodded even though a quiet discomfort settled in my stomach. Then came the spare house key. For years one had rested beneath a decorative stone beside the porch, exactly where Thomas had always kept it. One afternoon I reached for it after locking myself outside while watering the roses. It was gone. Vanessa smiled kindly when I mentioned it, and said they had removed it because leaving a key outside was no longer safe. She assured me they would always be available if I needed to get inside. Again, her words sounded thoughtful, yet I noticed that every solution required me to depend on someone else. Family dinners slowly changed as well. They were no longer held around my dining table every Sunday. Instead, Daniel suggested meeting at restaurants because it would be easier for everyone. Sometimes plans changed at the last minute because Emma had a soccer tournament or Vanessa had volunteered for a community event. I understood. Life stayed busy for young families. Still, the invitations became less frequent until entire weeks passed without hearing laughter inside my home. One Saturday morning, I walked into the garage searching for a box of old holiday decorations. Thomas had always labeled every shelf with careful handwriting. While looking around, I realized several of his woodworking tools were missing. Daniel later explained that he had borrowed them for a weekend project and forgotten to mention it. I believed him because I wanted to believe him. That evening I stood on the back porch watching the sun disappear beyond the maple trees Thomas had planted nearly 30 years earlier. I suddenly remembered the conversation I had overheard through the kitchen window. The sooner we get her comfortable with depending on us. At first those words had sounded strange. Now they echoed through every little change that had quietly entered my life. None of those moments proved anything by themselves. Together, however, they formed a pattern that I could no longer ignore, and for the first time since losing my husband, I began wondering whether I was grieving one loss while another was unfolding right in front of me. I kept telling myself that I was imagining things. Grief has a way of making ordinary moments feel heavier than they really are, and I desperately wanted to believe that was all this was. Thomas had always warned me not to jump to conclusions. He believed that people deserved the benefit of the doubt, especially family. So I tried to follow the lesson he had lived by for more than 4 decades. I smiled when Daniel called. I thanked Vanessa for every casserole, every bouquet of flowers, every thoughtful text message asking how I was feeling. On the surface, nothing looked wrong. Yet every week seemed to leave me feeling a little more like a guest in my own life. One afternoon, I opened my calendar to mark Emma's middle school choir concert. She had proudly told me about it during one of our Sunday dinners months earlier. I had even bought a new lavender sweater because purple was her favorite color. When I called Daniel to ask what time I should arrive at the school auditorium, there was a long silence before he answered. Then he quietly explained that the concert had already taken place 3 days earlier. Vanessa had assumed someone had told me. I laughed softly and said it was probably my mistake, but after we hung up I stared at the empty calendar on my kitchen counter for several minutes. My name had simply disappeared from another family memory. A few weeks later, Mother's Day arrived. For years, Thomas had prepared breakfast while Daniel brought flowers and Emma made handmade cards covered with glitter and crooked hearts. That Sunday morning, I waited until nearly noon before my telephone finally rang. Daniel apologized and explained that they had decided to spend the weekend with Vanessa's parents because everyone happened to be available at the same time. He promised they would celebrate with me another day. Another day never came. The flowers I eventually received were delivered by a local florist with a printed card instead of a handwritten message. I placed them in water anyway and thanked God that at least someone had remembered my address. Summer arrived, bringing warm evenings and neighbors working in their gardens. One Saturday, I noticed photographs on social media showing Daniel, Vanessa, Emma, and several cousins gathered around a picnic table at the lake where our family had celebrated Independence Day for years. I recognized the same old pavilion where Thomas had grilled hamburgers every July. I had not received an invitation. When I gently mentioned the gathering to Daniel a few days later, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. He said the trip had been planned quickly and assumed I would not enjoy spending an entire afternoon in the heat. His explanation sounded thoughtful enough, yet no one had actually asked what I wanted. Little by little, I began remembering other moments that had seemed harmless at the time. Birthday dinners scheduled without telling me until afterward. Weekend visits shortened because unexpected errands suddenly appeared. Conversations that stopped the moment I entered a room. None of those memories had hurt very much by themselves. Together, they formed something impossible to ignore. It was as though I had been standing at the edge of every family photograph, while smiling for a camera that no longer pointed in my direction. One evening, I opened the old cedar chest where Thomas kept family albums. As I slowly turned each page, I realized every picture told the same story. Families do not drift apart all at once. Sometimes they move away one quiet step at a time, and by the time you finally notice the distance, you can no longer remember exactly where it began. The more I looked back, the more I realized that Thomas had quietly protected me in ways I had never fully appreciated. He never made a grand speech about it. He simply noticed things before I did. Whenever Daniel became impatient as a teenager, Thomas would gently redirect the conversation before feelings were hurt. When holiday plans became complicated after Daniel married Vanessa, Thomas somehow found a compromise that made everyone feel included. At the time, I thought our family simply worked well together. I now understood that my husband had been carrying far more of that balance than I had ever recognized. One rainy afternoon, I climbed into the attic searching for an old quilt Emma used to love as a little girl. Instead, I found several boxes labeled in Thomas's careful handwriting. One held family photographs. Another contained Christmas ornaments wrapped in faded newspaper. At the bottom sat a weathered cedar box that I had not opened in years. Inside were birthday cards, anniversary letters, and little notes Thomas had written throughout our marriage. I settled onto the attic floor and slowly unfolded one of them. It had been tucked inside a Father's Day card nearly 15 years earlier. In his familiar handwriting, he had written, "If anything ever happens to me first, promise me one thing. Never believe that you are a burden. This home is yours because it is the life we built together." Tears filled my eyes, but for the first time in months, they did not come from loneliness alone. They came from remembering the quiet confidence my husband always tried to give me. I spent the rest of the afternoon reading letters I had forgotten existed. Some were simple reminders to buy milk. Others thanked me for raising Daniel with patience and kindness. One described the day we bought our little brick house after saving for years. Thomas wrote that every room represented sacrifice, hope, and shared dreams. As I closed the final letter, I realized something important. Thomas had never spoken about our home as an investment. He spoke about it as the place where our family learned who they were. That evening, Daniel stopped by after work. He noticed the old photo albums spread across the dining table and smiled when he recognized pictures from his childhood. For a few precious minutes, we laughed together about camping trips, science fair projects, and the puppy that had chewed every shoe in the house. It almost felt like old times. Then Vanessa arrived carrying takeout containers for dinner. Her smile remained warm, but her eyes quickly moved from the photographs to the stack of papers beside them. She casually asked whether I planned to keep all the old documents or finally sort through them. It sounded like an innocent question. Even so, something about the timing unsettled me. I quietly placed Thomas's letters back inside the cedar box before answering that I would decide later. During dinner, the conversation drifted toward home maintenance. Daniel mentioned that property taxes seemed to increase every year. Vanessa nodded sympathetically and remarked that large houses often became difficult for widows to manage alone. She immediately added that she was only thinking about my comfort, and perhaps she truly believed those words. Still, I noticed that every discussion somehow returned to this house, as though the walls around us had become part of a conversation no one wanted to explain directly. That night, I carried the cedar box into my bedroom instead of returning it to the attic. As I placed it inside my closet, I remembered Thomas's handwritten promise one more time. For months, I had been searching for reassurance from the people still living around me. I suddenly realized that the clearest voice reminding me of my own worth belonged to the man who had been gone all along. 2 mornings after I placed Thomas's letters inside the safe deposit box, my doorbell rang just after 9 o'clock. I smiled when I saw Margaret Collins standing on my porch with a paper bag from the bakery we had visited together for years. We settled into the kitchen with fresh coffee and warm blueberry muffins, talking about ordinary things the way old friends always do. She asked about my roses. I asked about her church choir. For nearly half an hour, life felt almost normal again. Then Margaret grew unusually quiet. She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug without taking another sip. "Eleanor," she said softly, "I have been trying to decide whether I should tell you something. I kept hoping I was wrong." My heart sank before she even continued. Margaret explained that one of her closest friends, Linda, had worked at a local real estate office for more than 20 years. The previous week, while the two of them were having lunch together, Linda casually mentioned meeting a younger couple who had spent nearly an hour asking questions about preparing an older family home for a possible future sale. Margaret would have forgotten the conversation immediately if Linda had not later shown her a neighborhood map while discussing current property values. Margaret instantly recognized my street. She did not know which house they had been discussing until she happened to stop by the grocery store 2 days later. As she walked through the parking lot, she saw Daniel and Vanessa getting into their sport utility vehicle. Vanessa was holding the same distinctive blue folder Margaret had seen Linda carrying at lunch. Margaret did not approach them. She simply watched them drive away while an uncomfortable feeling settled over her. I still told myself it could all be a coincidence, she admitted. Maybe they were asking questions for someone else. I immediately nodded in agreement because that was exactly what I wanted to believe. I told Margaret there had to be another explanation. Daniel loved this house. He had learned to ride his bicycle on the sidewalk in front of it. Thomas had built his first treehouse in the backyard. Surely my own son would never discuss my future without me sitting at the table. Margaret reached across and gently squeezed my hand. I hope you are right, she whispered. I truly do. But I also know you well enough to recognize that something has been troubling you ever since Thomas passed away. Her words lingered in the quiet kitchen long after neither of us spoke. As soon as she left, I walked slowly into the family room where dozens of framed photographs lined the bookshelf. There was Daniel at 6 years old wearing an oversized Little League uniform. There he was again graduating from college with Thomas standing proudly beside him. I picked up one photograph from Emma's 5th birthday party and smiled through unexpected tears. No, I quietly told myself. He would never intentionally hurt me. Even then, I found myself making excuses for every strange conversation, every forgotten invitation, every uncomfortable silence. Grief had already taken my husband from me. I refused to let suspicion take my son as well. Yet as I carefully returned the photographs to the shelf, another thought quietly settled into my mind. If there truly was an innocent explanation, then the truth would eventually protect Daniel. But if there was not, I needed the courage to discover it before someone else began making decisions about the only home Thomas and I had ever built together. The next Monday, I followed Margaret's advice. I did not call Daniel. I did not question Vanessa. I decided that if there was an explanation, I wanted facts before emotions entered the conversation. After breakfast, I gathered every folder Thomas and I had carefully organized over the years. Property tax statements, insurance policies, mortgage records that had long since been marked paid in full, and every document related to our home were stacked neatly inside 2 blue storage boxes. Thomas had always believed that important papers should be easy to find, and for the first time since his passing, I silently thanked him for that habit. I drove across town to the local bank where we had kept our accounts for decades. The familiar branch manager, Mr. Henderson, recognized me immediately and offered his condolences once again. After a few minutes of conversation, I asked whether there had been any recent changes to my accounts or any requests for additional access. He carefully reviewed everything and reassured me that nothing unusual had taken place. The accounts remained exactly as Thomas and I had arranged them. His answer brought me a measure of relief, but it also deepened my curiosity. If nothing had changed financially, then why did every conversation with Daniel and Vanessa seem to circle back to my house? Before leaving the bank, I rented a small safe deposit box for Thomas's letters and several original documents that I did not want lying around the house. It was not because I suspected anyone would take them. It simply gave me peace of mind knowing they were secure. From there, I drove to the office of an attorney whom Thomas and I had worked with years earlier when we updated our estate plans. The receptionist smiled kindly and arranged a short appointment later that afternoon. Sitting in the waiting room felt strangely familiar, almost as though Thomas should have been beside me reading one of the magazines scattered across the coffee table. When the attorney welcomed me into his office, I explained that I was not there because of a dispute. I simply wanted to understand exactly what my legal rights were now that I was living alone. He reviewed the documents carefully, answering each question with patience. He confirmed that the home belonged to me according to the existing records and that no one could make decisions about it without my knowledge and consent. Hearing those words lifted a weight I had been carrying for weeks. I left his office with a folder of updated copies and a clearer understanding of where I stood. As I drove home beneath a bright autumn sky, I noticed something unexpected. I no longer felt frightened. I felt prepared. That evening Daniel called and invited me to dinner at his house later in the week. His voice sounded cheerful, almost eager. Vanessa had made my favorite chicken pot pie, he said, and Emma wanted to show me a school project she had been working on. I accepted the invitation without hesitation. There was no reason to refuse. In fact, I wanted to go. Whatever questions remained unanswered would eventually reveal themselves, but I had made one quiet decision during that long day. I would stop reacting out of fear and start paying attention with calm eyes. For months, I had allowed grief to cloud my judgment. Now, with every important document safely organized and every conversation replaying in my memory, I sensed that I was finally beginning to see my family's story as clearly as it truly was, even if I was not yet ready for where that truth might lead. 3 evenings after meeting with my attorney, Daniel invited me to dinner again. His voice sounded lighter than it had in weeks, and he insisted that Emma had been asking when Grandma would come over. I baked a small peach cobbler before leaving the house because bringing dessert had become a tradition long before Daniel was old enough to drive. As I walked toward their front porch carrying the warm baking dish, I caught myself smiling. Part of me still hoped Margaret had misunderstood everything. Part of me still believed that once we all sat around the same table, I would discover there had never been anything to fear. Dinner began exactly the way family dinners always had. Emma eagerly described her science class. Daniel teased her about spending more time naming her project than building it, and we all laughed together. Vanessa complimented my cobbler and asked whether I had finally managed to prune the climbing roses before the weather turned cold. For nearly an hour, I allowed myself to relax. I remembered what Thomas used to say whenever our family gathered. Ordinary evenings often become the memories we treasure most. Then, as Emma carried her dishes into the kitchen, Vanessa quietly placed a colorful folder on the dining table. "We have been thinking about you," she began gently. "Not because anything is wrong. We just want to make sure you have the easiest life possible." Daniel nodded in agreement before sliding the folder toward me. Inside were photographs of several retirement communities, floor plans for smaller homes, and neatly organized brochures highlighting walking paths, fitness centers, and social activities. Everything looked attractive. Everything had been carefully prepared. I slowly turned each page without saying a word. Vanessa smiled reassuringly. "We spent a lot of time researching these places. They are beautiful, and they would take away so much stress." Daniel leaned forward. "Mom, the house is just a lot for one person now. We worry about you all the time." I looked from one brochure to the next before asking the only question that mattered. "When did the two of you start planning all of this?" Neither of them answered immediately. Finally, Vanessa spoke. "A few weeks ago. A few weeks ago." Those words echoed quietly inside my mind. That meant the conversations had begun long before anyone had ever asked me how I felt. Long before anyone had wondered whether I even wanted to leave the home Thomas and I had built together. They had spent weeks discussing my future while I remained completely unaware. Daniel reached across the table and gently rested his hand near mine. "We thought it would be easier if we had everything ready before talking to you." His voice carried kindness, but his words landed with unexpected weight. Everything ready. My future had become a project that other people were organizing. I was no longer being invited into the conversation. I was being introduced to a plan that already existed. I closed the folder carefully and looked at both of them. I thanked them for caring enough to spend time researching different possibilities. I told them I appreciated their concern more than they probably realized. Relief immediately appeared on their faces, as though they believed I had accepted everything inside the folder. I simply smiled, gathered my coat, hugged Emma goodbye, and drove home through the quiet autumn streets. As I unlocked my front door and stepped inside the house Thomas and I had filled with 43 years of memories, I understood something with complete clarity. The deepest betrayal is not always someone trying to take your home. Sometimes it is discovering that the people who love you have quietly stopped believing your voice deserves to be the first one heard when decisions about your own life are being made. The meeting took place the following Friday afternoon. I arrived a few minutes early and found Daniel and Vanessa already waiting in the reception area. They both smiled warmly when they saw me. Daniel stood to help me with my coat, and Vanessa asked whether I had found the office without any trouble. Their kindness was familiar now. I had learned that kindness and assumptions could exist side by side. A few minutes later, We were invited into the same conference room I had quietly visited earlier that week. Seeing the familiar bookshelves and polished wooden table gave me an unexpected sense of calm. I already knew exactly why I was there. The attorney greeted each of us before taking his seat. He explained that today's meeting was simply an opportunity for everyone to discuss long-term planning together. There was nothing unusual about families having these conversations, especially after the loss of a spouse. Daniel began speaking first. He explained that he wanted to help make life easier for me in the years ahead. Vanessa added that they had researched several options because they believed planning ahead would prevent unnecessary stress later. Neither of them sounded selfish. Neither of them sounded cruel. They sounded like two people who genuinely believed they were solving a problem without realizing they had forgotten to ask the one person whose opinion mattered most. The attorney listened patiently before turning toward me. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, "have you had an opportunity to review your own estate planning and property documents?" I smiled politely. "Yes," I answered. "I met with you earlier this week for exactly that reason." Daniel looked at me with visible surprise. Vanessa blinked, but remained silent. The attorney nodded. "Then, that is very helpful. Mrs. Brooks has already reviewed her legal position and understands that all future decisions regarding her home and estate remain entirely hers unless she personally chooses otherwise. My role today is simply to make sure everyone understands that any future planning begins with her wishes." The room fell completely silent. There was no dramatic revelation because there did not need to be one. The truth was remarkably simple. No brochure, no good intention, and no family discussion could replace a conversation with the person whose life was actually being planned. Daniel slowly leaned back in his chair. For the first time since Thomas passed away, I saw uncertainty replace confidence in his expression. After several long seconds, he quietly looked at me instead of the attorney. "Mom," he said, "did you think we were trying to make these decisions without you?" I held his gaze before answering. "I did not have to think it, Daniel. You already had folders, brochures, and conversations before anyone asked me what I wanted." My voice remained calm. I was not accusing him. I was simply describing what had happened. Vanessa lowered her eyes toward the table. "I thought we were helping," she said softly. I never stopped to ask whether helping and deciding had become the same thing. No one spoke for another moment. Finally, the attorney closed the folder in front of him and offered the simplest advice of the afternoon. Families usually solve these situations best when everyone speaks before assumptions become plans. As we walked out of the office together, no one argued. No one slammed a door. Yet something important had changed. For the first time since Thomas's funeral, my son was no longer trying to decide what my future should look like. He was finally beginning to ask me what future I wanted for myself. The weeks after our meeting at the attorney's office were surprisingly quiet. Nobody argued. Nobody raised their voice. In many ways, the silence said more than any conversation could have. Daniel called less often, perhaps because he did not know what to say. Vanessa stopped sending brochures and articles about retirement communities. For the first time in months, no one tried to convince me that someone else knew what was best for my life. I spent those weeks doing something I had almost forgotten how to do. I lived at my own pace. I worked in my garden until my knees reminded me it was time to rest. I baked bread on rainy afternoons simply because the smell made the house feel warm again. Every evening I sat on the back porch watching the sun disappear behind the maple trees Thomas had planted decades earlier. Little by little, the house no longer felt empty. It felt peaceful. Nearly a month passed before Daniel appeared at my front door one Saturday morning. He was alone. In his hands, he carried the old wooden toolbox that had belonged to Thomas. Without saying much, he walked into the garage and placed it back on the workbench where it had always been. For several moments, we simply stood there surrounded by shelves that still held traces of my husband's careful craftsmanship. Finally, Daniel spoke. "I have been thinking about Dad a lot," he said, quietly. "The more I thought about him, the more I realized he never made decisions for you. The two of you made them together." He looked down at the floor before continuing. "Somewhere along the way, I stopped asking what you wanted. I started assuming I already knew." It was not a dramatic apology. There were no tears and no long speeches. Somehow that made his words feel more honest. I rested my hand on the old workbench and smiled gently. "You were trying to protect me," I said. "But protecting someone should never mean replacing their voice with your own." Daniel nodded without trying to defend himself. That simple moment meant more to me than any promise he could have made. Trust is not rebuilt in one afternoon. It returns through small choices repeated over time. During the months that followed, our relationship slowly changed. When Daniel wanted to help with a project around the house, he asked first. When Vanessa invited me to family gatherings, she stopped assuming my answer and simply let me decide. Sometimes I accepted. Sometimes I preferred to stay home with a good book and a cup of tea. Either choice was respected without guilt or persuasion. Emma still visited often, and together we planted new flowers beside the front porch every spring. Watching those young plants take root reminded me that families, like gardens, need patience, honesty, and room to grow. Losing Thomas broke my heart in ways I will never fully describe. Discovering how easily people can mistake love for control changed me in different ways. Yet I do not believe that my story is really about betrayal. I believe it is about remembering that grief does not erase dignity, age does not erase wisdom, and love should never require surrendering the right to choose your own life. Every evening, before turning off the lights, I still glance at the photograph of Thomas smiling beside our front porch on the day we bought this little brick house. I smile back now, not because life became perfect again, but because I finally understand the greatest gift he left me. It was never the house itself. It was the confidence to stand inside it, make my own decisions, and continue living with the quiet strength we spent 43 years building together. Thank you for listening and for being part of our community. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel for more inspiring and thought-provoking stories.